Hello everyone, this is my presentation. It's going to be on speculative fiction, and it's used to discuss, dissect, and draw attention to consequential social issues, including issues relating to marginalized groups. Speculative fiction typically refers to science fiction and fantasy, but in reality it can be used to refer to any piece of literature that portrays a world different than our own. For example, Margaret Atwood does not consider her works to be science fiction because, according to her, there's nothing in them that couldn't actually happen. In creating worlds of their own, spec-fic writers are able to disregard the rules of this world and thus make more palatable certain philosophical, political, or intellectual issues that readers may not otherwise be comfortable discussing or reading about. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World dissects class stratification and the dangers of unchecked consumerism. Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 laments the devaluation of intellectualism. Even Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is a critique of industrialized warfare. While those are all important literary works, they are also all told from the perspective of white men, and discussing or critiquing marginalization can be problematic when it's being seen through the eyes of a group which has historically done most of the world's marginalization and oppression. I once watched an interview with Game of Thrones author George R.R. Martin, wherein he was asked why so much fantasy is Eurocentric and patriarchal, and he answered by saying simply, because most fantasy has been written by white men. He then went on to list examples of some authors of color, fantasy literature such as N.K. Jemisin and Ken Liu, to illustrate how the fantasy landscape is becoming more diverse. And while it is true that speculative fiction is becoming more inclusive, just having more ethnically diverse characters and authors does not necessarily mean that you're in touch with contemporary issues. Tony Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone trilogy is set in a fantasy kingdom based on pre-colonial Africa and was written in response to widespread reports of police brutality of African Americans. All the characters in this novel are black. There is no group or culture that is meant to be analogous to European or American colonialism. Instead, it chooses to focus on the concept of racism within races. There is a group in this kingdom known as Magi who have magical powers and are oppressed by the monarchy for fear that they may one day overthrow them. The nobility is the same color and from the same country as the Magi, but they portray them as less than human. They call them maggots, so that they can oppress them, take away their rights, and, commit essentially a genocide against them. Another good recent example is R.F. Kuang's Poppy War trilogy, which is set in a country based off of pre-modern China and portrays events based on the rape of Nanking and Mao's Cultural Revolution. The trilogy does touch on racism and colonialism, but it primarily focuses on how war affects people. Tolkien's works also discuss war, but they are told from the perspective of characters who represent nobility, knights, lords, and kings, whereas Kuang's books focus on how war affects regular people, peasants getting their towns destroyed. You have female characters who get raped. You have thousands of people who suffer under famine and are turned into refugees. It's something that's very relevant to our world, what with, the this war we've been fighting for 20 years, what with, this refugee crisis, what with, the military-industrial complex and its influences on our political system. So, but it's just told in this fantastical setting where there's magic. So it's just not, it's not necessarily intended to be a political book, but it's, it has that element of politics, element of contemporary issues injected into it. I mentioned Margaret Atwood. This is a copy of her book, The Handmaid's Tale, which takes place in a dystopian alternate history where women are enslaved and forced to be, breeders because global fertility has plummeted. So it's this sort of religious theocracy that's taken over America and imposing its will on people. Now this and works by, say Octavia Butler, who wrote a book called Kindred, which is about an African-American woman in the 70s who has to travel back in time to make sure that a white slave master rapes her great-grandmother so that she can be born. These also are some earlier examples of speculative fiction that discuss marginalization, discuss oppression. They have their narratives told from the perspective of women, African Americans, marginalized groups. So this has been done before in science fiction and fantasy, but it's really starting to become mainstream now. And books don't necessarily have to be intentionally political. One book that I read recently was Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This is just an adventure story, but it deals with things that are very relevant, that are very socially conscious. For example, there's a group that I think at least, are analogous to Nazis that hunt magic users. They consider them witches, consider them less than human. They, hunt them down, they arrest them, and they execute them, put them in prison. And there's also a character in here who's from a culture that's analogous to Romani gypsies. She, at one time, was indentured as a sex worker, and her appeal was that she had this really smooth, dark skin. And that's sort of a commentary on how, on this kind of creepiness of exoticizing someone, making them an object of sexual fetish because of their skin color or from what culture they're from. And it has, also has some LGBTQ representation. So it's, you kind of, it's slowly becoming, especially in like young adult literature, that, in speculative fiction, there has to be some kind of representation of people of color, LGBTQ people. And that's a trend that's really taking hold recently, and not even just from, books by authors who represent those groups. There's a fantasy trilogy by J. Kristoff called Nevernight, where the main character is bisexual. So, fantasy is becoming much more open-minded, science fiction too, and that wasn't always the case. So you're seeing this new and emerging trend. One magazine which, has gotten a hold of this trend in just an excellent way is Strange Horizons. They are a weekly online publication of speculative fiction, literature, poetry, essays, reviews. They believe that speculative fiction in the 21st century must be inclusive, and they pride themselves on publishing works by authors from underrepresented groups, from diverse backgrounds with diverse concerns. They are a non-profit. Most of their funding comes from grants and donations, and authors who have published with them have won Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Awards, among others, and those are the big awards in fantasy. One fascinating piece I read in this magazine was an article called Queering the Cyborg. It was in part a review of Max Gladstone's recent novel, This Is How You Lose the Time War. It's an epistolary novel about two cyborgs from different civilizations trading correspondences with each other. It explains how a cyborg can be defined as any conglomeration of a natural biological human body or any biological being and some kind of artifice. And that the hybrid nature of the cyborg typically, which typically makes it monstrous, can act as an avatar for queer identities struggling to find a place in a normative world. You know, and this artifice, it can be anything that a human being can use to express themselves. In the case of this novel and this article, writing and reading are that artifice. They are a form of hybridization, and by trading correspondences, they become hybrids of each other. They plant seeds of themselves in each other, and that seeds grows, and it makes them a combination of each other. There's also another really fascinating article about black feminist vampire stories. It lists, like I already mentioned, a novel by Octavia E. Butler, and it's contrasting them with white, kind of patriarchal, heteronormative vampire stories. I guess, fun, this is kind of interesting because, like, the original, most well-known vampire story, Dracula, that actually does have some interesting interpretations to be made from it, because it's from the point of view of, like, white Anglo-Saxon, English people who are fighting off this evil that comes from Eastern Europe, the Near East. And at the time it was written, the Near East, those were not seen as white. They were kind of seen as less than human. So it's about these, Westerners fighting off this foreign influence that's coming to feed off of their women. But this article is more talking in terms of, like, more recent popular vampire stories, I guess, like maybe Twilight, Interview with the Vampire, True Blood, those sorts of things. And it explains how, while those white vampire stories are more about dominance, more about hierarchy, these black feminist, black female-centered vampire stories, they feature characters that emphasize, like, community. They emphasize trust. The white patriarchal vampire literature is about hoarding power, and these stories, they feature black female vampires who, interestingly, by both being non-white, black, and vampires, they are sort of seen as doubly monstrous in their, in society. So these are about finding an identity on the fringes, an identity that, sort of, fighting against these stigmas, but also realizing an identity that is outside of norms. And rather than being, rather than hoarding power, rather than preying on people, rather than being a victim, these vampires in these stories, they seek consent from their victims. They create bonds with them that last eternity. It's like simultaneously lover and parent, and that was a very fascinating story to read, because monsters are monsters are both an enemy, but they're also, and you've seen this in more recent media, like Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water. The monster is kind of easy to identify with. People have been starting to identify with monsters. They've been starting to sympathize with them as we've become more, woke, as we become more literate to oppression. Monsters have become important to us. It's acceptable now to see monsters as victims, not necessarily something we need to destroy. And these stories that are mentioned in this article were ahead of that curve, and they are, of course, meaningful because they come from these groups that were marginalized, creating, like I said in the beginning of this presentation, creating a world that has different rules than ours, so that we can discuss these issues which are taboo in a way that is palatable. I'll talk some more about some fiction pieces now. These aren't necessarily about diversity, but they do touch on contemporary issues, and they are from the points of view of groups that are somewhat marginalized. There is a fiction piece called The Touch Pool. It's about a woman whose daughter goes missing and returns to her after she's transformed into some kind of sea monster. Again, going back to the motif of identifying with the monster. And it deals with grief and loss and human relations from a woman's point of view, from a mother-child point of view, and it also in part is about climate change because she lives in this town that's by the sea, that the sea level is rising. So that's some commentary there. That's an extra layer that I thought was very fascinating. Another story is Dirty Wi-Fi, which is told from the point of view of a character which I believe is genderqueer. I don't think it's not entirely clear in the story. Having a digital relationship with someone, and it kind of talks about Wi-Fi, the internet, as like a tangible resource, like oil or water. It mentions islands drowning in clickbait. There's one passage which reads, "I scoop the Wi-Fi router humidifier filter for some coagulated Wi-Fi and heat it over the stove to inhale the fumes." Sort of a comment which I read as a commentary of how we're addicted to the internet, and and it also deals with the climate crisis because it mentions the sea level rise, and it mentions sort of like environmental degradation, and it's also about the difficulty of maintaining human interaction through technology and how alienating that is. Another piece I read is called Orientation, and it's very subtle. I'm not entirely sure what's happening, but I think it's implied that there's been some global catastrophe and human civilization has been wiped out, and a group of survivors, they kind of wake up revived in this strange facility, and they've been disconnected with their bodies, so it's all about reconnecting with them, and they're sort of walking around observing each other, noticing how bizarre our bodies are to an outsider, and it deals with connection, and it also deals with lack of bodily autonomy and sort of the futility of human civilization. So it's these very it's dealing with these very uncomfortable, controversial, sort of difficult topics that are relevant to people and are universal, and it's creating them in a place that is safe, and it's sort of almost you could say kind of softening them, sort of, because because speculative fiction, it creates a distance between us and the real world that realistic literary fiction doesn't, and it makes it more comfortable to discuss these things. Okay, so how does this relate to my work? I am admittedly a recent fantasy fan, and not that recent, but it's only recently that I've gotten heavily into it. So, and I've gotten into it right as these trends were happening, and it's recently that I've started to write my own fantasy. And of course, if you want to be successful in this genre currently, you need to sort of at least participate in this trend, and that is somewhat tricky for me because I am a white man, so I don't particularly have a first-hand understanding of some of these problems with marginalization. And so that is really the question, which is, how do you write about the struggles of a group that has been oppressed and marginalized if you are not one of, a person who's a part of that, who is a part of that group? How do you write about and discuss and critique these consequential contemporary issues that you don't have a first-person understanding of? That how do you talk about this in a way that is, not to say uncontroversial, because it's impossible to avoid controversy with these things, but how do you talk about it in a way that is articulate, that is sensitive, that is nuanced? And, especially when it's dealing with things like race, when you're trying to be inclusive and portray characters of a certain ethnicity, certain color, certain religion that you are not a part of. So I've been doing that is that kind of, you have maybe your main character is, at least this is what I'm doing, this is what I've seen, like, Lee Bardugo doing, and and so a few others. George R. R. Martin, for example, is another one. Is that you kind of have your main characters be, a representative of you. They be your race. They be your, your gender. But kind of you have side characters. You have supporting characters who, are, of course, important to the story. Of course, are pivotal and consequential to the story. Who are of a certain race. Who are of a gender identity that is different to you, who are different sexual orientation than you, different religion. And this is true for writing in general, but it's especially true for when you're trying to portray characters whose life experiences, whose cultural backgrounds, ethnicity, religion, gender identity, sexuality are not a reflection of yours. Is you have to be sensitive, you have to be nuanced, you have to, what am I doing on time? You have to do your research, and you really have to, you especially have to make them good characters, make them nuanced, make them complex. Don't make them perfect. Show them as people, but also, don't make them caricatures. Don't be, show the shades of gray. I'm trying to do that, that's what I've been trying to do, is I'm trying to capture these experiences in a way that's not, especially not in a way that's like fetishistic or voyeuristic. Strange Horizon, in their mission statement, they want stories that portray groups that does not exoticize them or fetishize them. So I have a character, in the piece I'm writing now for Brian Friend's class, who's a black girl. I'm not a black girl, so I'm just kind of trying to portray her as a person, but also not kind of like whitewash her, sort of, make that a part of who she is as a person, but not all of who she is. And, she is not a main character. She's not the main character. She is a character. And also, this is something I've gotten, so that's just something, I realize I'm rambling here, and I guess the thing to say is just be careful, be cognizant, and just treat people as people, and also see how other authors are doing it, and, again, keep asking yourself a question, is this something that's okay for me to be writing about? Because we saw this recently with like American Dirt, which is you have an author who's writing about the experiences of undocumented Mexican immigrants who does not have a connection to undocumented immigrants to the Mexican community. So the best thing you can do is be sensitive. The best thing you can do is be nuanced, be informed, and do your research, because I believe fiction, not just speculative fiction, fiction in general, literature, it has a great power in that it allows us to be empathetic towards us to experiences lives that we would not otherwise get to experiences, and that's why it's important, and that is an obligation that we as authors have, and that to really show our fellow writers, fellow readers, the experiences, to show them that they're a thing, to foster empathy for people who are not like us. So I realized that was not very articulate, but I think I got the finer points of this presentation, and I hope you enjoy it, Rob. I hope everyone who sees this enjoyed it and got something from it. Everyone, good luck surviving Corona. Bye.